A series on understanding Putin and the war in Ukraine. Anyone who doesn't miss the Soviet Union has no heart. Anyone who wants it back has no brain. This is Vladimir Putin's most famous political statement on the Soviet Union. It paints him as a mature statesman who respects historical glory while understanding the tragedies of the past. Yet in 2000, when he controversially brought the melody of the Soviet national anthem back to the Kremlin, many began to wonder if the ultimate goal of this new czar, handpicked by Yeltsin, was to resurrect the USSR. In reality, Putin's feelings about the Soviet Union are incredibly complex. The deep-seated roots of both the annexation of Crimea and the current war in Ukraine can be traced back to this complicated relationship. And to understand the connection between Putin, the Soviet Union, and modern Russia, we have to start with that decision to change the national anthem. From 1944 until its collapse in 1991, the Soviet Union used an anthem with music by Alexander Alexandrov. After the USSR dissolved, the new Russian Federation's first priority was to make a clean symbolic break with the past. Yeltsin abolished the Soviet anthem and replaced it with an orchestral piece by a 19th-century Russian composer, which he named the Patriotic Song. But the Patriotic Song had a fatal flaw. It had no lyrics. Throughout the 90s, it was played as a purely instrumental piece at official events, leading to many awkward moments. At the Olympics, Russian athletes had to stand on the podium in embarrassed silence. The military found the tune lacking in power and unable to inspire national unity. Yeltsin tried multiple times to commission official lyrics, but in the State Duma, every political faction saw it as an opportunity to push its own ideology. The endless bickering meant that no lyrics were ever approved. When Putin came to power in 2000, the national anthem had become a divisive, politically exhausting, and unresolved historical issue. He had two options. The first, and simplest, was to finally find lyrics for the patriotic song. He certainly had the political clout to break the deadlock in the Duma. The second was to find a new anthem entirely, a move that would stir up new controversies and create unnecessary trouble. Any other politician would have chosen the first option. But Putin, the newly elected president, decisively chose the second. And even more shockingly, the new anthem he chose was none other than the melody of the old Soviet anthem, the one that had been used for half a century. The announcement sent shockwaves in Russian society. Former President Boris Yeltsin broke his post-retirement silence and published an open letter to Putin. The letter, which widely publicized, argued that Putin's choice was a symbolic rejection of the path Russia had chosen in 1991. It was a matter of principle, a betrayal of the new Russia. Yeltsin wasn't the only one who objected. Liberal political parties and Russian intellectuals who had been active during the Soviet collapse, as well as Western-funded human rights activists, all fiercely criticized the decision. But Putin didn't back down. He knew that the melody of the Soviet anthem was deeply embedded in the memories of several generations of Russians and was extremely popular with the general public. He also had the backing of powerful political forces, including the Communist Party, which genuinely dreamed of a Soviet restoration, as well as military and veterans groups. In December 2000, the State Duma passed Putin's bill with a large majority. He had successfully ended a decade-long debate over the nation's symbols. However, the anthem was just the beginning. In his early years in power, a series of Putin's actions seemed to signal to the world that his goal was the complete revival of the Red Empire. Passed at the same time as the anthem law was a bill concerning the Victory Banner, the Soviet flag raised over the Reichstag in Berlin on May 1, 1945. The law stipulated that replicas of the flag, complete with the hammer and sickle, would be used alongside the Russian flag at official military events. The Russian military also began to readopt the Soviet-era Red Star as one of its main symbols. Putin also reinstated Chekist Day,
as the official holiday for security service workers and created a Hero of Labor of the Russian Federation award, a direct copy of the Soviet Hero of Socialist Labor. And Putin's Soviet nostalgia wasn't just symbolic. A core tenet of his foreign policy has been the integration of the post-Soviet space. He first built a Russian-led military alliance of former Soviet republics through the Collective Security Treaty Organization, CSTO. Then he launched the Eurasian Economic Union, an attempt to revive the old Soviet-era economic bloc. Each of these moves has fueled speculation and criticism from the outside world. Some in the Western media have accused Putin of being lost in a fantasy of Soviet restoration, of trying to satisfy his own lust for power and the Russian people's longing for a great nation by dredging up historical relics. But this accusation is deeply unfair to Putin, not because he doesn't want to restore a powerful Russia, but because the critics have missed the point. Putin isn't trying to restore the Soviet Union. He's trying to build a 21st century Russian empire. The only reason these Soviet-style changes have been so successful is that they tap into a widespread nostalgia among modern Russians. Since 1992, the independent Levada Center has been tracking Russian sentiment on this issue. Their data shows that the percentage of Russians who regret the collapse of the Soviet Union has consistently remained above 50%. At times climbing as high as 65 to 75%. But this doesn't mean that Russians want the USSR back. Their feelings are a mix of intense love and intense hatred. What do they miss? First and foremost, the superpower status and the national pride that came with it. They miss the days when Russia was America's equal, when Moscow's voice was heard and respected around the world. Second, they miss the might of the Soviet military, an army that could defeat Nazi Germany and project power across the globe, a stark contrast to the Russian army that was humiliated in Chechnya. But they also hate the Soviet Union, the omnipresent KGB, the suppression of free speech, the rigid bureaucracy. These were the things that made them support Yeltsin in 1991, and they are the reason they don't want the USSR to make a full comeback. In short, Russians miss the Soviet Union because it was strong on the outside, but they hate it because it was rotten on the inside. Therefore, a true Soviet revival is impossible. But what the Russian people do want is a new, powerful state that can rival the Soviet Union at its peak. So while Putin has adopted some of the symbols of the Soviet era, he has consistently and harshly criticized its core ideology. On the issue of Ukraine, for example, he has repeatedly and publicly attacked Lenin and the Bolsheviks, accusing them of making a historic mistake by artificially creating the Ukrainian Republic and planting a time bomb for future separatism. At the same time, he has promoted the Russian Orthodox Church, traditional family values, and a strong sovereign state, all things the official Soviet ideology sought to suppress or eliminate. In his view of history, Putin praises Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, the czars of the Russian Empire, not the leaders of the Soviet Union. This is why his famous quote, "No heart for those who don't miss it, no brain for those who want it back," is so revealing. For Putin, the Soviet era represents the zenith of Russian hard power. Not forgetting it means setting that peak as the goal for the future. But saying you'd have to be brainless to want it back is his way of giving himself an out, of saying he has no intention of returning to the old ideology. For the Russian nation, the Soviet Union is a closed chapter of history. But for Putin, it was never the main quest. He has more important things to do. On September 1, 2004, Chechen terrorists stormed a school in southern Russia, taking 1,200 people hostage. The Beslan school siege would become the next major test of his rule.